Hey all, we're back with the Glass Castle. Where we left off was Jeanette was thrown out of the car because the door came open and she fell out of the car and the car drove away. And luckily, the parents realized what happened and came back for her. And so that's where we stopped. It's kind of the end of a section. We're starting on page 36 in the document that I gave you. We lived in Las Vegas for about a month, in a motel room with dark red walls and two narrow beds. We three kids slept in one, Mom and Dad in the other. During the day, we went to the casinos, where Dad said he had a surefire system for beating the house. Brian and I played hide and seek among the clicking slot machines, checking the trays for overlooked quarters, while Dad was winning money at the blackjack table. I'd stare at the long-legged showgirls when they sashayed across the casino floor, with huge feathers on their heads and behinds, sequins sparkling on their bodies and glitter around their eyes. When I tried to imitate their walk, Brian said I looked like an ostrich. Okay, so the first thing to know about this is the dad is gambling to get the family money. And the only real way that you can win consistently with gambling, especially at a blackjack table, is by counting cards. So you remember which cards were played, and then you know the likelihood of the other people like being able to play certain cards. Like, okay, I know this card's been played. I know this ace has been played, so that means there's only three more in the deck. And so that's what the father's doing, which is illegal. One of my students in the college students that I taught wrote a creative nonfiction piece about how where he grew up in Mexico, there was a casino and the people thought he was counting cards and they threw him out and almost beat him up behind the casino. So that's the kind of stuff that happens if you count cards. At the end of the day, Dad came to get us, his pockets full of money. He bought us cowboy hats and fringed vests, and we ate chicken fried steaks in restaurants with ice cold air conditioning and a miniature jukebox at each table. One night, when Dad had made an especially big score, he said it was time to start living like the high rollers we had become. He took us to a restaurant with swinging doors like a saloon. Inside, the walls were decorated with real prospecting tools. A man with garters on his arms played a piano, and a woman with gloves that came up past her elbows kept hurrying over to light Dad's cigarettes. So it sounds like they went to a Western style restaurant, like the Wild Wild West. And we see a prospector mentioned. Remember, the father's trying to build a prospector so that they can find gold out west. Dad told us we were having something special for dessert, a flaming ice cream cake. The waiter wheeled out a tray with the cake on it, and the woman with gloves lit it with a taper. Everyone stopped eating to watch. The flames had a slow, watery movement, rolling up into the air like ribbons. Everyone started clapping, and Dad jumped up and raised the waiter's hand above his head as if he'd won first prize. And notice fire comes back again. We've gotten fire a few times with Jeanette getting burned, her melting her Barbie doll, and now we also have this too, where there's this flaming cake. A few days later, Mom and Dad went off to the blackjack table and then almost immediately came looking for us. Dad said one of the dealers had figured out that he had a system and had put the word out on him. He told us it was time to do the skedaddle. We had to get far away from Las Vegas, Dad said, because the mafia, which owned the casinos, was after him. We headed west through the desert and then mountains. Mom said we should all live near the Pacific Ocean at least once in our lives, so we kept going all the way to San Francisco. So in this case, with him being convinced, the father being convinced that the mafia is after him, that might not necessarily be far from the truth. Because I told you my student almost got beat up behind a casino because they thought he was counting cards. So this is actually a time where it made sense that they ran away. Mom didn't want us staying in one of those tourist trap hotels near Fisherman's Wharf, which she said were inauthentic and cut off from the real life of the city. So we found one that had a lot more character in a place called the Tenderloin District. Sailors and women with lots of makeup stayed there too. Dad called it a flop house, but Mom said it was an SRO, and when I asked what that stood for, she told me the hotel was for special residents only. While Mom and Dad went out looking for investment money for the prospector, again, them looking for gold, while Mom and Dad went out looking for investment money for the prospector, we kids played in the hotel. One day I found a half-full box of matches. I was thrilled because I much preferred the wooden matches that came in boxes over the flimsy one in the cardboard books. I took them upstairs and locked myself in the bathroom. I pulled off some toilet paper, lit it, and then when it started burning, I threw it down the toilet. I was torturing the fire, giving it life and snuffing it out. Then I got a better idea. I made a pile of toilet paper in the toilet, lit it, and when it started burning, the flames shooting silently up out of the bowl, I flushed it down the toilet. So again, we have Jeanette playing with fire, which is dangerous. Like if you've heard the phrase playing with fire, you don't want to play with fire because you'll get burned. This is what's happening. She is trying to show that she has control over it. She is lighting it and then putting it in water. She's lighting it again, putting it in water, lighting a whole bunch of it and then flushing it down the toilet. She is trying to show that she has power and control over it and that her fear of it can't control her. One night, a few days later, I suddenly woke up. The air was hot and stifling. I smelled smoke and then saw flames leaping at the open window. At first I couldn't tell if the fire was inside or outside, but then I saw that one of the curtains, only a few feet from the bed, was ablaze. Mom and Dad were not in the room, and Lori and Brian were still asleep. I tried to scream to warn them, but nothing came out of my throat. I wanted to reach over and shake them awake, but I couldn't move. The fire was growing bigger, stronger, and angrier. And this makes sense. If you think of the fight or flight response, there's also a freeze response, where if something bad is happening, sometimes someone will freeze. So she can't scream, she can't move. And in the previous scene, we see her playing with fire, showing she's like, I have control over this. But now we see, obviously, she doesn't have control over fire. It's burning down the hotel that they're in. She wants to think she has control over it, but it's so obvious that she does not. And it's a really dangerous thing. Just then, the door burst open. Someone was calling our names. It was Dad. Lori and Brian woke up and ran to him, coughing from the smoke. I still couldn't move. I watched the fire, expecting that at any moment my blanket would burst into flames. Dad wrapped the blanket around me and picked me up, then ran down the stairs, leading Lori and Brian with one arm and holding me in the other. Dad took us kids across the street to a bar, then went back to help fight the fire. A waitress with red fingernails and blue-black hair asked if we wanted a Coca-Cola or, heck, even a beer because we'd been through a lot that night. Brian and Laura said yes, please, to Cokes. I asked if I might please have a Shirley Temple, which was what Dad bought me whenever he took me to a bar. For some reason, the waitress laughed. So the waitress is offering children alcohol because they've been through it because of the fire that night, which is illegal. You can't do that. The people at the bar kept making jokes about women running naked out of the burning hotel. All I had on was my underwear, so I kept the blanket wrapped tightly around me. After I drank my Shirley Temple, I tried to go back across the street to watch the fire, but the waitress kept me at the bar, so I climbed up on the stool to watch through the window. The fire trucks had arrived. There were flashing lights and men in black rubber coats holding canvas hoses with big jets of water coming out of them. I wonder if the fire had been out to get me. I wondered if all the fire was related, like Dad said all humans were related. If the fire had burned me that day while I cooked hot dogs was somehow connected to the fire I had flushed down the toilet and the fire burning at the hotel. I didn't have the answers to those questions, but what I did know is that I lived in a world that at any moment could erupt into fire. It was the sort of knowledge that kept you on your toes. After the hotel burned down, we lived for a few days on the beach. When we put down the back seat of the green caboose, there was room for everyone to sleep, though sometimes someone's feet would be sticking in my face. One night a policeman tapped on our windows and said we had to leave. It was illegal to sleep on the beach. He was nice and kept calling us folks, and even drew us a map to a place where we could sleep without getting arrested. Okay, so the hotel burned down, and Jeanette is wondering whether all fire is related, if all fire comes from the same fire. So she is thinking of fire as a person. She keeps putting out the fire. She keeps trying to show that she is in control of it, and now she's also wondering if it's out to get her, which is childlike logic. I mean, it makes sense to think about that. She was almost killed as a child because she set herself on fire while cooking hot dogs, and now maybe just a few years later, this hotel burns down that she's in. So it would make sense to me that she's afraid of fire and worried that it's out to get her. But after he left, Dad called him the goddamn Gestapo and said that people like that got their jollies pushing people like us around. Dad was fed up with civilization. He and Mom decided we should move back to the desert and resume our hunt for gold without our starter money. These cities will kill you, he said. And so we see how the father treats the cop. Jeanette makes it very clear that the cop was very nice to them and said, look, you can't sleep here, but if you sleep in this place, no one will bother you. Like, no cops will come after you or anything like that. And then the father is like, basically, this person's terrible. He's out to get us and things like that. But we see from Jeanette's point of view, that's not what was going on with the cop. Okay, and this is our next section, and it starts on page 39. After we pulled up stakes in San Francisco, we headed for the Mojave Desert, near the Eagle Mountains. Mom made Dad stop the car. She'd seen a tree on the side of the road that had caught her fancy. It wasn't just any tree. It was an ancient Joshua tree. It stood in a crease of land where the desert ended and the mountain began, forming a wind tunnel. From the time the Joshua tree was a tiny sapling, it had been so beaten down by the whipping wind that, rather than trying to grow skyward, it had grown in the direction that the wind pushed it. It existed now in a permanent state of wind-blownness, leaning over so far that it seemed ready to topple, although, in fact, its roots held it firmly in place. Okay, so I want you to think about how Jeanette's family is similar to this Joshua tree. The Joshua tree is still, it looks like it's going to fall over, but it's still rooted in the ground. It's still in the earth. It's still living in a place where there's not much life because it's in a desert. So I want you to think how is Jeanette's family, despite everything that they've been through, how are they still surviving? How are they still a family? I thought the Joshua tree was ugly. It looked scraggly and freakish, permanently stuck in its twisted, tortured position, and it made me think of how some adults tell you not to make weird faces because your features could freeze. Mom, however, thought it was one of the most beautiful trees she had ever seen. She told us she had to paint it. While she was setting out her easel, Dad drove up the road to see what was ahead. He found a scattering of parched little houses, trailers settling into the sand, and shacks with rusty tin roofs. It was called Midland. One of the little houses had a for rent sign. What the hell, Dad said. This place is as good as any other. And so they decide to settle there just because the mother sees the Joshua tree. But I want you to think about... Jeanette thinks the Joshua tree is ugly, that it's freakish, that it's scraggly, that it's not pretty to her. But the mother thinks it's beautiful. And so I want you to think about how the mother and how Jeanette, how they both view struggle. Because this Joshua tree has definitely struggled. It's living in a place where the winds basically made it so it would grow in like all crooked. Instead of straight up, it grows crooked. And then, yeah, and it's just, there's not enough water. We see the town, it's described as parched, which is, if you're parched, you're thirsty. You're dehydrated, you don't have enough water. And so I want you to think about how the Joshua tree has struggled and how the family has struggled. The house we rented had been built by a mining company. It was white with 2 rooms and a sway-backed roof. The Renault trees and the desert sand ran right up to the back door. At night you could hear the coyotes howling. When we first got to Midland, those coyotes kept me awake, and as I lay in bed, I'd hear other sounds. Gila monsters rustling in the underbrush, moths knocking against the screens, and the creosote crackling in the wind. One night when the lights were out and I could see a sliver of moon through the window, I heard a slithering noise on the floor. "I think there's something under our bed," I said to Lori. "It's merely a figment of your overly active imagination," Lori said. She talked like a grown-up when she was annoyed. So that's pretty funny. So figment is like a small piece, and then overly active, like an imagination that runs wild. I tried to be brave, but I had heard something. In the moonlight, I thought I saw it move. "Something's there," I whispered. "Go to sleep," Lori said. Holding my pillow over my head for protection, I ran into the living room where Dad was reading. "What's up, Mountain Goat?" he asked. He called me that because I never fell down when we were climbing mountains. Sure-footed as a mountain goat, he'd always say. "Nothing, probably," I said. "I just think maybe I saw something in the bedroom." Dad raised his eyebrows, but it was probably just a figment of my overly active imagination. And so now she's quoting her sister. "Did you get a good look at it?" he asked. "Not really." "You must have seen it. Was it a big old hairy son of a bitch with the damnest looking teeth and claws?" "That's it. And did it have pointed ears and evil eyes with fire in 'em, and did it stare at you all wicked-like?" he asked. Yes, you've seen it too?" "Better believe I have. It's that old ornery bastard demon." "Okay, and I want you to notice fire came up again. Evil eyes with fire in 'em. So we have fire come up again with this demon. Okay. Dad said he had been chasing Demon for years. By now, Dad said that old demon had figured out that it had better not mess with Rex Walls. But if that sneaky son of a gun thought it was going to terrorize Rex Walls' little girl, it had, by God, got another thing coming. "Go fetch my hunting knife," Dad said. I got Dad his knife with the carved bone handle and then the blade of blue German steel, and he gave me a pipe wrench, and we went looking for Demon. We looked under my bed where I had seen it, but it was gone. We looked all around the house, under the table, in the dark corners of the closets, in the toolbox, even outside in the trash cans. "Come here, you sorry-ass old demon," Dad called out in the desert night. "Come out and show your butt-ugly face, you yellow-bellied monster." "Yeah, come on, you mean old demon," I said, waving the pipe wrench in the air. "We're not scared of you." There was only the sound of the coyotes in the distance. "This is just like that chicken shit demon," Dad said. He sat down on the front step and lit up a cigarette, then told me a story about the time Demon was terrorizing an entire town, and Dad fought it off in hand-to-hand combat, biting its ears and sticking his fingers in its eyes. Old Demon was terrified because that was the first time it had met anyone who wasn't afraid of it. "Damn old Demon didn't know what to think," Dad said, shaking his head with a chuckle. "That was the thing to remember about all monsters," Dad said. "They love to frighten people, but the minute you stare them down, they turn tail and run. All you have to do, Mountain Goat, is show old Demon that you're not afraid." Okay, and so I actually think this is kind of sweet. Instead of just saying, like, there's no monster, just go back to bed, the father creates, like, this elaborate story and gets them... And gets Jeanette out, like, trying to threaten the demon and be like, "You better not come back," or, like, "You better come and face us." But then it doesn't come. So it shows that Jeanette has some power over the demon. And so I actually think this is kind of sweet. Not much grew around Midland other than the Joshua tree, cacti, and the scrubby little creosote bushes that Dad said were some of the oldest plants on the planet. The great-granddaddy creosote bushes were thousands of years old. When it rained, they let off a disgusting, musty smell so animals wouldn't eat them. Only 4 inches of rain fell a year around Midland, about the same as in the northern Sahara, and water for humans came in on the train once a day in special containers. The only animals that could survive around Midland were lipless, scaly creatures such as Gila monsters and scorpions and people like us. And so we see the Joshua tree again. We see that the Joshua tree lives without much water. Even humans can't live out here because there's not enough water. The train comes in and brings them bottled water because there's not enough for wells, there's not enough for a reservoir. And the things that are here are that do live here are dangerous, like scorpions, and a rattlesnake comes up later as well. So I want you to again think like how can the Joshua tree survive on very little, and how does this family survive on very little? Both do. But I want you to think about that, like what we've learned about Jeanette and her family over the course of the book, like what have they survived on that you feel like isn't enough? And then compare it to the Joshua tree, because 4 inches of rain fall a year in this place. That's not very much water. So the Joshua tree survives even though the odds are completely against it. A month after we moved to Midland, Juju got bitten by a rattlesnake and died. And remember, Juju's the dog. We buried him near the Joshua tree. It was practically the only time I ever saw Brian cry, but we had plenty of cats to keep us company. Too many, in fact. We had rescued lots of cats since we tossed Quixote out the window, and most of them had gone and had kittens. And it got to the point where we had to get rid of some of them. We didn't have many neighbors to give them to, so Dad put them in a burlap sack and drove to a pond made by the mining company to cool equipment. I watched him load the back of the car with the bobbing, mewing bags. It doesn't seem right, I told Mom. We rescued them. Now we're going to kill them? We gave them a little extra time on the planet, Mom said. They should be grateful for that. So this is really messed up. This is so messed up. They adopted all these cats, and then they had kittens, and now it's like, oh, we have too many cats. We don't know what to do with them. We're just going to toss them in the pond. And I think it's also interesting that the pond, it's man-made, but it's not water that anyone can drink. It's made to cool equipment. Which means there's all sorts of toxins in it. It would not be drinkable. It would be poisonous water. But that seems like it's the only pond around. Okay. This really disturbs me. Like, this is a huge amount of animal cruelty. Dad finally got a job in the gypsum mine, digging out the white rocks that were ground into powder, used in drywall and plaster of Paris. When he came home, he'd be covered with white gypsum powder, and sometimes we'd play ghost and he'd chase us. He also brought back sacks of gypsum, and Mom mixed it with water to make Venus de Milo sculptures from a rubber cast she ordered through the mail. It grieved Mom that the mine was destroying so much white rock. She said it was real marble and deserved a better fate, and that by making her sculptures, she was at least immortalizing some of it. And so immortalizing means to make something last beyond you. And so she's trying to make something beautiful out of the rock that's being destroyed. Like, she gets bits and pieces of it and makes sculptures with it. So you can tell she's a really creative person. Mom was pregnant. Everyone hoped it would be a boy so Brian would have someone to play with other than me. When it got time for Mom to give birth, Dad's plan was for us to move to Blythe, 20 miles south, which was such a big town it had 2 movie theaters and 2 state prisons. So that's a little interesting. If the main features of a town are 2 movie theaters and 2 state prisons, it's probably not very big. There's probably not a whole lot around it. That's 2 state prisons. That's a lot of people, probably. But if the main thing with the town are 2 state prisons, maybe that's a pretty small town. In the meantime, Mom devoted herself to her art. She spent all day working on oil paintings, watercolors, charcoal drawings, pen and ink sketches, clay and wire sculptures, silk screens, and wood blocks. She didn't have any particular style. Some of her paintings were what she called primitive, some were impressionistic and abstract, some were realistic. I don't want to be pigeonholed, she liked to say. Mom was also a writer and was always typing away on novels, short stories, plays, poetry, fables, and children's books, which she illustrated herself. Mom's writing was very creative. So was her spelling. She needed a proofreader, and when Lori was just 7 years old, she would go over Mom's manuscripts checking for errors. Okay, so there's a lot of interesting stuff going on right here. So the mother is obviously very creative. She does all different kinds of art. I'm going to give you some examples of these on the worksheet so you know what they all mean. Um, and then and then also we know that she is a writer and she writes all sorts of different types of things. And we also know that Lori, the 7-year-old sister, is better at spelling than the mother. So that's interesting because I don't think any of them have so far had any formal schooling. Like maybe they've been in school a little bit, but they've moved around so much that they've been jumping from school to school to school, and then the father doesn't trust places like hospitals. So my guess is he probably doesn't also trust schools. That's my own assumption. But I don't really think these kids are going to school. And somehow Lori is a much better speller than the mother. While we were in Midland, Mom painted dozens of variation and studies of the Joshua tree. We'd go with her and she'd give us art lessons. One time I saw a tiny Joshua tree sapling growing not too far from the old tree. I wanted to dig it up and replant it near our house. I told Mom that I would protect it from the wind and water it every day so that it could grow nice and tall and straight. Mom frowned at me. You'd be destroying what makes it special, she said. It's the Joshua tree's struggle that gives it its beauty. And so here we have struggle again. The mom says it's the struggle that gives something beauty. It's the struggle that also gives this family beauty. And that makes this and makes the Joshua tree who it is. It makes this family who it is. And so that's really important and with how the Joshua tree represents this family. This is another important tip. If an image comes up multiple times, so we have had fire, we also have this Joshua tree, that means the image is important. The way I always wrote papers was I would look through a book and I would track images and I would say, okay, we got fire on page 5, we have fire on page 10, we have fire on page 36. And I would grab quotes from those places wherever there was fire and then figure out what fire meant based on those quotes. It's the same with the Joshua tree. And so that's a tip if you ever find yourself writing a paper on this that you can use. Okay, now we're in the next section and it's on page 44. I never believed in Santa Claus. None of us kids did. Mom and Dad refused to let us. They couldn't afford expensive presents, and they didn't want us to think we weren't as good as other kids who, on Christmas morning, found all sorts of fancy toys under the tree that were supposedly left by Santa Claus. So they told us all about how other kids were deceived by their parents, how the toys the grown-ups claimed were made by little elves wearing bell caps in their workshop at the North Pole actually had labels on them saying, "Made in Japan." So this is kind of sad. Like the family just doesn't have enough money for them to really do Christmas in the way that a lot of other families might. So they just say like, look, Santa Claus isn't real, because they didn't want the kids to feel bad that that their peers were getting gifts, that other people around them were getting gifts, but they weren't. Try not to look down on those other children, Mom said. It's not their fault that they've been brainwashed into believing silly myths. And then the parents say it's silly to believe in Santa Claus, too. We celebrated Christmas, but usually about a week after December 25th, when you could find perfectly good bows and wrapping paper that people had thrown away, and Christmas trees discarded on the roadside that still had most of their needles, and even some silver tinsel hanging on them. Mom and Dad would give us a bag of marbles or a doll or a slingshot that had been marked way down in an after-Christmas sale. And so this family, we see them doing Christmas the best they can in their own way. They don't have a whole lot of money, so they wait until after Christmas is over with, so that they can get things on the side of the road and then they can afford some of the things in the stores. And I think that's a really creative way to do everything, so then they can still have the holiday, they can still have the spirit of Christmas. It's just a little bit later. Dad lost his job at the gypsum mine after getting into an argument with the foreman, and when Christmas came that year, we had no money at all. On Christmas Eve, Dad took each of us kids out into the desert night, one by one. I had a blanket wrapped around me, and when it was my turn, I offered to share it with Dad, but he said no thanks. The cold never bothered him. I was 5 that year, and I sat next to Dad, and we looked up at the sky. Dad loved to talk about the stars. He explained to us how they rotated through the night sky as the earth turned. He taught us to identify the constellations and how to navigate by the North Star. Those shining stars, he liked to point out, were one of the special treats for people like us who lived out in the wilderness. Rich city folks, he said, lived in fancy apartments, but their air was so polluted they couldn't even see the stars. We'd have to be out of our minds to want to trade places with any of them. And so he's saying that the wilderness is beautiful. That's one thing about this family. They really appreciate nature. They really love what nature has, no matter where they are. And what he's talking about in terms of pollution is probably light pollution. It could also be air pollution as well, but lights make it harder to see the stars at night. Pick out your favorite star, Dad said that night. He told me I could have it for keeps. He said it was my Christmas present. You can't give me a star, I said. No one owns the stars. That's right, Dad said. No one else owns them. You just have to claim it before anyone else does. Like that Dago fellow Columbus claimed America for Queen Isabella. Claiming a star as your own has every bit as much logic to it. I thought about it and realized Dad was right. He was always figuring out things like that. I could have any star I wanted, Dad said, except Betelgeuse and Rigel, because Lori and Brian had already laid claim to them. I looked up to the stars and tried to figure out which was the best one. You could see hundreds, maybe thousands, or even millions twinkling in the clear desert sky. The longer you looked and the more your eyes adjusted to the dark, the more stars you'd see, layer after layer of them gradually becoming visible. There was one in particular, in the west above the mountains, but low in the sky, that shone more brightly than all the rest. I want that one, I said. Dad grinned. That's Venus, he said. Venus was only a planet, he went on, and pretty dinky compared to real stars. She looked bigger and brighter because she was much closer than the stars. Poor old Venus didn't even make her own light, Dad said. She shone only from reflected light. He explained to me that planets glowed because reflected light was constant, and stars twinkled because their light pulsed. And so he's saying Venus is tiny, it might not be as good as other stars, and Venus doesn't even though it's a planet, which is cool, it doesn't give off its own light like stars do. I like it anyway, I said. I had admired Venus even before that Christmas. You could see it in the early evening, glowing on the western horizon, and if you got up early, you could see it in the morning after all the stars had disappeared. What the hell, Dad said. It's Christmas. You can have a planet if you want. And he gave me Venus. So I think this is actually really sweet. They don't have money, so this is a really creative way to give all the kids a gift that they can always have with them. Anywhere they go, they can see these stars. And in Jeanette's case, a planet. And the interesting thing about Venus, too, Venus is a planet in astrology that represents love. And so we see the love that the father has for the kids in this act of letting them pick a star to have for Christmas. And I can really see that too. I mean, I have a constellation tattooed on my back, Orion, and whenever I see it in the sky, I feel like I'm at home because I could always see it from my bedroom window. So these are things that the kids don't physically carry with them, but they can see anywhere they go and that they'll always have. That evening over Christmas dinner, we all discussed outer space. Dad explained light years and black holes and quasars and told us about the special qualities of Betelgeuse, Rigel, and Venus. Betelgeuse was a red star in the shoulder of the constellation Orion. It was one of the largest stars you could see in the sky, hundreds of times bigger than the sun. It had burned brightly for millions of years and would soon become a supernova and burn out. I got upset that Lori had chosen a clunker of a star, but Dad explained that soon meant hundreds of thousands of years when you were talking about stars. Rigel was a blue star, smaller than Betelgeuse, Dad said, but even brighter. It was also in Orion. It was his left foot, which seemed appropriate because Brian was an extra fast runner. Venus didn't have any moons or satellites or even a magnetic field, but it did have an atmosphere sort of similar to Earth's, except it was super hot, about 500 degrees or more. So, Dad said, when the sun starts to burn out and Earth turns cold, everyone here might want to move to Venus to get warm, and they'll have to get permission from your descendants first. We laughed about all the kids who believed in the Santa myth and got nothing for Christmas but a bunch of cheap plastic toys. Years from now, when all the junk they got is broken and long forgotten, Dad said, you'll still have your stars. And so I think that's really sweet that they're going to have the stars their whole lives. Like that's a memory that no one can take from them. And both the stars are in Orion. Maybe I'll put a picture up of Orion for you all. Okay, so this is where we're going to stop. We're on page 47. That's where the last paragraph stopped. All right, I hope you enjoyed this, and I'll see y'all later.